Wait a minute. Well,
Okay, welcome to you today. My name is on the handouts, and on this particular handout, you have my picture as well, a little bonus. This is the first talk I started giving. All my talks, I've been giving talks for 9 years. This is the first talk I gave 9 years ago, and I did it actually exclusively for a year or so, and I gave about 100 talks. I've since revitalized it and come back, and people said, gee whiz, why don't you give that talk again? It happens to be a fun talk because a lot of other talks, I have 30 right now, and a lot of them deal with current events and with sociological situations. And they're educational, informative, and desirable, but not as much fun as this one particular one is. And it's called The Importance of You, as you can see. Now, for those of you who do not know who I am, who have not heard me before, and I see several people here, perhaps, that have not been at other talks I've given here or other libraries. My name, as I say, is on there. My picture's on there. And I graduated Harvard College. I have a degree in sociology, psychology, and cultural anthropology. Served in the U.S. Air Force in Korea. Came back to this country and attended Columbia University Graduate Business School and have an MBA in international business. After I graduated, I had several jobs, and I eventually worked for the IBM Corporation for 30 years in marketing, management, and in education. For the last 9 years, I've been talking to libraries in Nassau and Suffolk, independent and assisted living facilities in Nassau, Suffolk, Queens, Manhattan, Scarsdale, White Plains, Riverdale, a lot of other places, and in community centers and in private organizations. And I've developed over the time, people have liked what I've had to say, and they've invited me back, so it's really developed into like 30 talks at this point. And all my talks, I give out handouts, so you don't have to take notes. You can remember what I talked about, and you can discuss it later amongst your friends or family, whatever. But you have these already, so you don't have to take notes if you don't choose to. All of my talks are interactive, so I will call upon you to share some of your views, and in today, stories of things in your life. And you will see what I mean when I get into my talk today. The basic thing I want to bring out today is that you're magic. Now, this is not a magic show in the normal sense, but by the time I finish, you'll understand what I mean when I say you are magic. The fact is, I'm here to try to unlock your memories. The fact is that I believe that we are all unique. We've all gone different paths in our lives, but we're all sitting here in common. We have a lot of things in common at the same time. So we're both unique and have a lot of commonality as partners in the human race. So my goal is to do something like this here. No, that's okay.
Don't you want to use this?
No,
You have both hands?
that's fine, thank you. So the fact is that I'm here to unlock, you've seen this common trick with nails, and you can struggle with it for days and weeks. But if you give enough time and effort to it, you can separate them. And that's the objective of today. That's the objective, is to unlock your memory, to unlock stories, good stories or even bad, and you'll see what I mean when I get into my talk about the mind and remembering stories. The fact is, it's for our own benefit, number one. That's why the title, The Importance of You. It is for each and every one of us and you to feel important. And that is important for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's true. You have the years of wisdom and experience that you can pass on to others, but really it's to relive some of the good things in your own life for your own benefit. As we get older, we accumulate a lot of bad things that have happened to us, and some people dwell on the bad things, and nobody gets through life without bad things, okay? But we should always think more deeply and more commonly about good things that have happened to us. And that is part of what we're going to do today. The other side is that we're all connected. We all are connected, as I said before. And in sort of, let's say, as an example of that, the second page, which I'll refer to in a moment. But when I started doing this, some people say, well, why did you start this talk? Why did you get involved with this? Well, my daughter was after me for a number of years to write my autobiography, which I did start to do because of her insistence. And I gave it to my wife, to my son, and to my daughter to read. And my daughter, in a sense, echoed how they felt, and she wrote me a poem. She likes to write poetry, and she wrote me a poem. And I would like to share this with you as I have shared this with people in all my audiences. My daddy, a great man. You lived a whole lifetime before I was me. I never really knew all the things you had done. As I grow to understand your past more and more, you have transformed into a different someone. Growing up, you were always just my daddy, albeit the most devoted and caring daddy to exist. But in my egocentric world of developing into me, there's a whole part of you, Daddy, I ignored, I missed. Much more than my daddy lives within you. Beneath your exterior is a rich, impressive past. With your abilities, you could have been anyone and done anything. I can only pray that I can allow your legacy to last. It's easy to pass on the engaging stories and fond memories. You provide good material for that. So much thanks. But Dad, given your success rate and all that you've done, I don't know that I am capable of joining your ranks. I'm exceedingly fortunate merely to know you, but that you are my dad, I am blessed through and through. You're the most special man in the world, Dad, not because you're my dad, but because you are you. Now, every one of you could get that experience that I experienced when I read that from people that you love and hold dear and near to you. And that is what has compelled me, in a sense, to go out to the world, in a sense, and give these talks. Because, and the experience has been that it has been rewarding for them and for me. And that's why I say I've given this more than any one talk that I give for over 100 times at this point. And this is really, to me, which was compelled me, instilled in me the desire to go out to the various audiences. Now, the fact is that what I mean by that, when I said that we're all unique, this tells you that's the story, but it's also that we're all sort of connected. And my next page that you have given, in a sense, will show you that. How many people know all the people on those lists, on that list? You know all the people? Okay, could you tell us who they all are then?
Well, Frank McCord is a teacher and an author.
Yes. Well, let me just excuse you for a moment. So you know all these people here? If in all the audiences...
I know about them. I
No.
don't know the person.
Well, no. The point is,
Never had the pleasure.
if you know all these, you'll be the first audience ever to know all the people on this list, if you are in that category. So I'll mention a few names and you tell me if you really know who they are. Gustav Vigeland.
He's a sculptor.
Yes, and from where?
Norway.
My goodness, you do know that. You're one of the unique people. You must have been to Norway.
Yes, I know.
Okay, well, let me explain who Gustav Vigeland is to the audience. Gustav Vigeland was a sculptor, and in downtown Oslo, Norway, is a park called Frogner Park. And there are 100 sculptures done by this man and his associates that show life from beginning to end. They show children, grandparents, lovers, in all different situations, playing games, hugging, a grandmother making pigtails for her little daughter, a baby crying, and it shows life from beginning to end. the whole span of life. Now, the question is, where did he get this? Where did he get the feeling to do that? Who was his idol? Who was his person that he ever thought who he wanted to, in a sense, copy from a point of view of feelings? Does anybody know?
Couldn't be genetic? No? Nothing genetic? No.
No. The question is, he always idolized Auguste Rodin. And if you know Auguste Rodin, his sculptures are at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you've been to Paris, you perhaps have been to his studio where there were hundreds of his sculptures. And he always exhibited some sculptures that had feeling and meaning. And the fact is, two of his greatest one was The Thinker, and another one was called The Kiss.
Yeah, yeah.
Now the Kiss is for those of you who don't know what the Kiss sculpture is, it's a lovely young lady and a young man in an amorous embrace, kissing. Now, the fact is, that was an inspiration from somebody who had written about a couple 500 years earlier. And the man that had written about this couple was Dante. And in the Inferno, he wrote a story about this couple that he was a true story. This was not a made-up story. This is before Shakespeare, back in the 12th, 13th century, okay? And the story goes that this young lady was ready for marriage, and in those days, especially there amongst the upper classes of the society in Florence, the families got together and arranged the marriage. But they wanted the woman to actually, and the man obviously, to like each other, or at least be introduced, to see if they were somewhat compatible. Well, they brought this handsome young fellow over to meet this lovely young lady, and they eventually fell in love, and they agreed to get married. Well, okay, they set the plans, they set the plans, and the parents signed whatever contracts, because everything was either socially desirable or religiously desirable or economically or politically desirable in those days. So this is how it was. Families became extended families in this sense. And so they agreed to the marriage. The day of the wedding, the bride was standing there waiting for her husband to come. And all of a sudden, who shows up but this dwarfed person, very ugly, limping down the aisle. She said, my goodness. Now, in today's world, the young lady would do what? Run away, right? But in those days, and maybe in some societies even today, she had to go through with it, okay? So she did. But what they didn't realize, I guess, the families that made this deal, was that the person that she first met who fell in love with her and she fell in love with him was the brother of this person that she eventually had to marry. Well, in the extended family way, the families were always together. So the brother that she really loved and who really loved her, they obviously saw each other frequently and eventually had an affair. Well, they had an affair, and the husband caught them in the affair, and he killed them both. Again, this is before Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet tragedy, okay, in Florence, Italy. And the fact is, this was written as a true story by Dante in the Inferno, because he knew the uncle of this particular woman. Dante was one of the mentors, in a sense, even though 500 years between him and Rodin. And he took that story, and because of the feeling that it came across to him from that story, he sculpted The Kiss. Now, many of you, or some of you, or maybe none of you, are familiar with the Metropolitan Opera. Well, if you're familiar with opera, you know there's an opera called Francesca da Rimini. Francesca da Rimini is the story of this woman. So it inspired Rodin, and it inspired somebody to write an opera about that situation. So this has been perpetuated through the ages now and forever, in a sense, because of a feeling. So what I'm trying to portray in this page that you have here is that there's a connection. There's a connection between Rodin and Gustav Vigeland. I could have put Dante there, I could have put a lot of different things, but there's a connection. There's several connections here. There's a connection between Ted Koppel and several other people on the page. You know who Ted Koppel is, right? He established Nightline, which was a news program, but not just a politically oriented. He was fair, really one of the fair and balanced people in giving news stories. And one of the stories that he started on his show was he had read one day from a Boston newspaper, a professor who had written a story about his life and his philosophy as he was dying. And he was touched by that story, so he flew to Boston and he interviewed that person, that professor, and he decided to feature him on several shows, which he did do. And the fact is that this became a very popular segment of his show. A former student of that professor saw it, a fellow by the name of Mitch Albom, who lived in Detroit, was a successful sportscaster. And he said to himself as he saw one of those shows, he said, you know, he was my professor, and I promised when I graduated to follow some of his philosophy and do good in the world. But I did what most students do. They promise to do good, but in the end, what they do is they look for fortune and fame. And I've achieved fortune and fame. He was and is a famous sportscaster. Lo and behold, he said, I really have to go visit my old professor. And he flew to Boston every week. He flew once, made an agreement with the professor to show up on a frequent basis. So they agreed on one day that he would go up there, one day a week. He'd fly in and fly back to Detroit and listen to him and write down some of his philosophies. Well, this eventually became a book called Tuesdays with Maury. And that was Maury Schwartz was the professor. Now, Oprah, you all know who Oprah is, right?
Yeah.
Oprah read the book, loved it, and put it on as one of her Book of the Month club, and it became even more popular. Popular even to the point that Oprah decided to produce a movie called Tuesdays with Maury, and Jack Lemmon played Maury Schwartz. So here there are people from different walks of life, different ages, different ethnicities. They were all connected because of a feeling. How many people here have been to Stockbridge, Massachusetts and seen the Norman Rockwell Museum? The old one, maybe in the city or in the town, but no, I'm talking about the new one that's out in the fields. Have you been there? Yes. Have you read what's on top of the door when you enter the main entrance? Contributed by Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg didn't know him, wasn't related to him, didn't live in the same geographical area or anything else. But when Steven Spielberg, and I heard him say this when he was being interviewed, that when he was young, he used to read the Saturday Evening Post, or at least look at the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And as you remember, Norman Rockwell was the illustrator who did those front pages. And they all illustrated a warmth and a certain wonderfulness about American family life and growing up. He decided to give, when he found out they wanted to build a new museum, he decided to give millions of dollars to help construct that museum. He didn't know him, he didn't know him anything, but he did in his mind and in his body and in his soul felt he owed him something, because much of his humanity, he said, was somehow inspired by looking at those wonderful pictures that Norman Rockwell made, invented, created. So there's another connection, right? And that's the point of today. We're all connected. Now, I left off another name, Frank McCourt. This lady said, well, he's an author. He was a former teacher at Stuyvesant High School in New York City. He grew up in Limerick Island, and he wrote an autobiography called Angela's Ashes, about his mother growing up in poverty and in bad ways in Ireland. And he made it sound, he uplifted himself, as you know, because he's become a famous author now. But he's uplifted himself and others that read it, his book, with good humor and a positive frame of mind. So there's another aspect of remembering bad things, is that somehow you can learn things from bad things, or you can be inspired by bad things, or you can maybe revisit those bad things and come up with a different interpretation of what you really now think about what happened. And a case in point, tells some stories, in one of my talks, a gentleman said, talking about that, I'm just thinking, because your mind starts thinking about things when you're sitting there listening to somebody talk like I am doing now. And he said, I hated an uncle of mine for many years. And sitting here listening to you saying maybe we should revisit some of these old feelings and old stories, somehow I started thinking about my uncle. And I've hated my uncle for so many years. I said, well, okay, why do you hate him? He said, because when I was about 5 years old, my uncle used to come over our house and he had this most adorable puppy. And I used to play with him, and my whole love of animals, and dogs in particular, generated from that first experience with my uncle and his little puppy. Then one day my uncle came over and said he put his dog to sleep. And from that day on, I just didn't like my uncle. I felt he was cruel, he was not a nice person. And that was, when I was 5 years old, that's the impression. And I forgot why I disliked my uncle, but in remembering now, that's why I disliked my uncle. And I understood now, and I understand now, that he did something good, really, because I've had pets all my life, and I know that, dogs live 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years, and eventually they suffer, and you have to put them to sleep. So he did something good for my uncle, not bad. And I just connected the two now in my brain. He's in an assisted living home, excuse me, now, and I'm going to try to make amends to him. He doesn't know that I disliked him, but I really feel guilty, and I really want to do something nice for my uncle. So there's a story revisited that was a bad story, and yet revisited, it means something different. Going back to when I first started writing my autobiography, I had on occasion, when I was out with friends or relatives, to remember a story that I had just written that day. And there was one story I had told this couple we were out with, and at the time the couple were in their 80s. And I told a story, and the story went thus. My brother and I were close in age, and my sister was a few years younger. And when my parents went out, one of us, and we were left babysitting in a sense, one of us was her protector, and one of us was her antagonist. And in this one occasion, my brother and I had a little fight about that. And somehow we ended up in my sister's bedroom. And my sister's bedroom, she had two beds. One was where she slept. The other was my mother used to take a nap when the three of us used to go to school. And my brother and I fell on the one my mother used to take a nap on, and we broke it. And all of a sudden, we were the best of friends. And so we conspired to not fix it, because we didn't have tools. We didn't know the first thing about fixing things. So we conspired to somehow prop it up so that it looked like it was normal and still in good condition. So we did do that. And what we did was, we waited for my mother. The next day, she probably went to take a little rest, and it broke. And that was the story I told, or was telling. And I told my sister that story during the day, actually, because she was center to that story. And my sister said, well, Mom didn't tell you, but she told me, and she knew you broke the bed, but she never wanted to confront you two with it. So to me, that was a cute little story. So I told this to this couple, and while I was telling it, the woman started smiling. I said, why are you smiling? You remember a story similar? She says, well, not totally similar. It's when I was in the 2nd grade, the first day of school. I went to school with a beautiful little dress, my hair done beautifully in curls with ribbons, and beautiful patent leather shoes. And the teacher gave me a note to give to a friend of hers down the hall. So I was a precocious little thing, and I opened up the note, and it said, look at this precious little girl. Isn't she adorable? Look at her hair. Look at her this and that. And while she was telling the story, this woman who was about 83 or so at the time was beaming. She was 7 years old again when she was telling that story. That's part of what I'm trying to say today. When you tell a story, you are that person transported back to that time. It's healthier and it's better for you, okay? It's healthier and better. And in addition, when you tell it to a very young person, you become young. And they look at you not as we are looked at today. When I remember my grandparents, they were always in their 80s. They were never 20 or 30 or 12 or 3. They were always 80 years old. We didn't have, at the time, we didn't have movies and camcorders like we have here today, and recordings to show that they were young at one time. We didn't have all those kinds of pictures or devices. So I always thought them as old people. But when you tell a story, when you tell a story of that child's age, they then can understand you better. You can understand it. You can communicate better. You become younger. You appear younger. And for them, this is, my goodness, you were young at that time. Now, on my talk, by the way, and nobody, I should have asked you, is there anybody else's name on this connections list? Is there anybody else I didn't mention on this connections list?
Did you mention Rhoda and Augusta? You mentioned it?
I mentioned everybody, I think, but there's one person I didn't mention. Who was that? Does anybody have a... Well, the name that's not there is your own. There's YOU. Do you see YOU? You're in there. Okay? And the point, that's a very significant thing, is because the stories I tell, the stories I tell about me, the stories I tell about friends, the stories I tell about other people that have sat in audiences like yourself, they're all the same in a way, because they show that we all have history, that we all have something really important or warm to tell. Just before my wife and I came in here now, we sat for a few minutes with Linda, and she started telling us some stories about her and some things that were very warm and wonderful about her family. And you can do and should do the same thing. I will keep telling some stories to illustrate what I mean. Now, before I go any further, does anybody have any story of theirs that they want to share with the rest of us? No? Nobody has any? That's okay. You don't have to, as long as the goal today is for you to perhaps go home and do something, and we'll talk about that near the end of my talk today. But maybe you'll be inspired when I tell you some other stories from other people. Yes, ma'am.
I had organized my high school reunions, but no one had done anything, so on the 41st, I started every year after that. However, it was very difficult to get the women because more than likely they married, their names changed.
Yes.
So someone said she married someone by the name of Gemina. Her name was Hale, Ruth Hale. Gemina. So my son had purchased all the books from the telephone company, and we looked up Gemina, okay? He happened to be a minister. So I explained we're looking for Ruth Hale, same name, Gemina. Can you help us? Do you know who she would be? I sure know. She's my mother.
Oh, that's funny. That shows you the 6 degrees of separation, that everybody somehow, things happen like that all the time to people. Very interesting thing. Yes, ma'am.
Some time ago, I was talking to my granddaughter, and I said something about being an Italian, and so she said she didn't know what that was. Now, she is Italian, so I said to myself, this is not good.
Right.
So I started my autobiography.
Beautiful.
And every time she comes over, she'll ask me, Grandma, did you write anything more in there?
Yes.
And she's interested in it because I felt everything was being lost.
And it is lost. Our parents or grandparents, for the most part, didn't believe in revealing their inner thoughts to us. Some people have, and I'll tell some stories where they have, but most people didn't have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents that ever revealed anything. And they went through a lot of things to get to where we are today in this country. So therefore, that's fantastic. As a matter of fact, I have a story about an Italian that I'll tell now since you brought that up. In a library in Suffolk County, Harborfields to be exact, I had given this talk, this is 9 years ago, and a woman listened and came up afterwards and said, you know, and she started crying. She said, my father in 1941 went back to Italy. As all immigrant people do, they go back to see their parents or their brothers or their cousins or uncles, especially those from Europe, but now obviously from other parts of the world do the same thing. And he went back in 1941 and was caught in the war and didn't get back until after the war. And when he came back to this country, his daughter and his wife and other children wanted him to reveal how did he survive those years in Italy during the war. He had to be in hiding as an American. And what happened to the cousins and the grandparents and the aunts and uncles, what have you. And he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't talk, as was the usual for that generation. No matter what happened, they just didn't want to talk and give stories. Then one day he agreed to do it. And the next day he had a stroke and did not talk the rest of his life. And this woman was crying bitterly to my wife and myself and made me promise, and I willingly did promise, that I would tell that story every time I do give this talk. To tell the people that when they are gone, their stories, if not told, are gone. And the children, even if they don't want to hear it, eventually do. Eventually they do. And she was frustrated and upset that this whole history was lost to her family. She felt very, very much upset by it. As a matter of fact, today it's a big business, genealogy. There are big organizations now where you pay a lot of money, or you can go through the library and do a lot of it, the research for nothing. But the Mormon Church does it. There's several other internet websites that permit you to go and research things from your past. But we are still in the position to pass on some of that. Not only your stories, but maybe from your mother or your father or an aunt or a grandparent that there's no way they're going to, maybe never met, but there's a charming story involved. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking about that, recently we had a big family reunion. We had it, and all the generations came, and we started with my grandmother and grandfather, my maternal grandmother and grandfather, and we had the whole family tree, and there's one of the cousins who's kind of the keeper of the stories. And he's always asking all the aunts and uncles and anybody left all the stories. So we had the big tree up there with all the relationships, and many of us had our stories. And what was really wonderful to see was the younger cousins who don't have that same sense of the tree go, wanting to see the tree, wanting to hear the different stories. So it was really a wonderful experience just to watch the younger people wanting to know their own family history.
You see, for you and a number of you here, I don't have to be up here trying to convince you to do this, because you're in some audiences, a number of people have been doing these things, but most people don't. They don't have the time, they don't have whatever excuse you can have. But the fact is, it's valuable, again, it's valuable for them, but it's valuable for you. Yes, ma'am.
You're recording and preserving a dynasty.
Yes. Well, dynasty, not the Chinese Ming dynasty, but not the Bush dynasty, not the, you know, but yes, your dynasty, correct. That is one of the elements of human beings, is to relate and learn over time. But for some reason, families never did this. Okay? Only very few. But more and more are doing it, and I've charged myself with trying to, let's say, proselytize that you should all do something to pass on something. It doesn't have to be elaborate, doesn't have to be publishable. You know, I'm going to make a fortune, I'm going to publish this, and you know, and Barnes and Noble's going to carry it, or Amazon.com, or whoever. But it's something for you to feel. It's a feeling. That's the whole point of this page, the feeling, and passing on those feelings, because stories have a way of doing that. Yes, sir.
There are a lot of stories are lost also. I served in World War II.
Yes.
And during that time, aside from the fighting, the way the people lived and how fortunate we are today. Now they were,
Yes.
They didn't eat, they had no clothes, all that. The GIs never passed that on. They'll never
Well,
give
some
it-
do. I've heard
Well, I
some
don't
stories.
pass it on because I won't tell you, because we don't pass it, but maybe it's the one thing to do. To
Well-
compare what a good life we have.
Yes,
today.
yes.
We had the-
Yes, correct. Well, I will tell you a few stories about, well, I'll give you one more
I
story.
don't tell any.
You don't?
No.
Well, you should.
No.
I'll tell you one right now. The very first talk I gave, I almost stopped. I've been doing this 9 years, but the very first talk I gave at an assisted living in Lynbrook. And I was giving this talk, and I was about at this point saying, well, does anybody have a story? And a gentleman raised his hand. He says, I don't know what you're doing. It's not important. I'm depressed. We're all depressed here. You know, like, go home. You know, leave us alone. Okay? So I was ready to leave, and that was the end of my new career. So I said, so I felt, my back was against the wall. I said, sir, there must be something. You look about 85 or so. Maybe you served in the war. And he says, yes, I did. I said, okay, well, is there some interesting story you might want to tell? Now, this is very significant today, and I'll tell you why. He said, well, in 1940, and when he said 1940, I said, hey, he's really maybe, little, has a little memory problem. In 1940, I left this country and I went to England and joined the RAF. Now, those of you who are old enough to understand that, these people were ahead of the time in terms of feelings of liberty, freedom, and defending our way of life. Some guys went over and fought and joined the RAF in England to fight the Nazis, right? He was a strong-looking guy at 85 and handsome-looking guy, too. So I figured he would start telling us some stories, because some guys that have been in the war, when I called on stories, would tell you about when they were infantry, or when they had up a tank, they were in a tank. But this guy figured, he's going to tell us some stories of battles in the air with the Nazis. So he didn't say anything about that. He says, well, we were treated like heroes. And they were in England, because this is a year before we went to war even. And they were treated like royalty by the royalty. And he used to attend parties with Queen Elizabeth, who is in the United States today, right? Right. So it's significant me being here today and telling this story. He said, and we used to go to parties with her. As you know, if you saw The Queen, anybody see the movie The Queen? Well, you saw she was active in the war effort in her way, right? And he used to attend parties with her. So, and all of a sudden everybody was like, wow, and he became very talkative. I said, sir, I only have an hour. I mean, maybe you can discuss that and talk with your fellow residents later when we leave. Now, when I left that day, I spoke to the person who brought me in, and I said, this guy, I was ready to walk out, and this is the end of my desire to even do this kind of thing. She says, he's been here 3 months and he's never talked to anybody. But when I left, he was surrounded by people and he was talking to beat the band. And I've since later talked with that person, and he said, yes, he became a center of the social life here. And for 3 months he hadn't talked before he revealed something that all of a sudden was important to him and to the people around him. And that is the point of this whole session, okay, is that you become more important to yourself first, because I'm sure he wasn't as depressed after he realized that he had done something important. And he had something important maybe to share with some other people. So this is the item that I want to discuss with you. I have so many stories. In North Shore Towers, where I talk regularly, right over here in Floral Park, it's a huge cooperative apartments. It's a private golf course, a private country club where I speak there. A woman came in with her walker, and this goes back again 9 years ago. And she told the following story. She said, when I was in my 20s, she was 92, so that you're talking 70, back in the early 30s, she was traveling in Russia, an American woman. And she said, I was traveling in Russia, and I was on the Volga River. And I was on this filthy boat, and the weather was terrible, the food was terrible, but she was an adventuresome woman. You know, if a woman was traveling alone back in those days, you really had to be kind of adventurous, especially since she was American. She said, but I met a young man, and we kept each other warm at night. And this is from a woman in a walker, and as she told us, she let go of her walker, and she stood straighter, and her voice got stronger. Well, there was an immediate electricity. Now I'm talking about 200 people, because when I talk there, there's about 200 people listening. And all of a sudden, like either they wanted to hear more from her, or they maybe wanted to tell her some stories too. Because that's the thing about telling stories like this, is that people want to then come back and tell you a story. And everybody that tells a story, by the way, smiles. I've never had a person tell a story that didn't smile and enjoy telling that story, okay? So the point, what I'm trying to say is this woman, okay, who said that, came back to this country, got married, had children, and after the war, or just before the war, however it was, this man escaped Russia and came over here. And she had him over for dinner, and then he went his way, and she hers. She had great-grandchildren by this time, and she said he has great-grandchildren by this time, and he doesn't live anywhere near New York. She grew up in Great Neck and lived with her family there. And so he left out of state. But for every month, for 70 years or so, they have conversed with each other, either by phone or by letter. Now this is unrequited love or different kind of love, because she was happily married, he was happily married, but they had some connection, there's some feeling, okay? And that's really what I'm trying to say. And these are people from the audience like yourself telling these stories, okay? At the very same place, and I got 2 stories that night at the Towers, it's called North Shore Towers. A woman stood up and said, you know, I knew why you were coming, and I want to show you what I've done. Like you've said what you've done, you've said what happened in your family. She said, I knew why you were coming, and she showed a book this thick. She said, my parents were married for 60-something years, and every month my father would write a love letter to my mother. And this is the book, and I had 60 books prepared. I had one big impasse, though, to the whole thing. It was all in Yiddish. So she had to find somebody to translate that, but she produced 60 books for the future, as you said, for the future generations. People that will never know her or her parents have this book about their roots. Remember back, was it Huxley? Not Huxley. Haley. Alex Haley. He wrote about roots, about the black slave experience. Roots. Even for slaves, it was important for people who had become free and now are free. Their roots was important to them, as your family tree is important to you, as you are, in a sense, interested in educating your granddaughter in what it is to be an Italian. Okay? The fact is, every race, ethnicity, person has a desire to do it, but most don't do it. And most young people have a desire, even if they don't even show it or mention it. Later in life, they'll feel they miss something if they don't have it. So that's another. So I can have story after story, but you know, I don't want to stop anybody here from telling a story that has shown some warmth and some connection with other people and family. Yes.
I don't know if this, I was in a play 76 years ago. I was 8 years of age then.
Oh,
Now
very
my-
nice.
Now my granddaughter, 8 years of age, she was in the Charlie Brown Christmas in
Oh,
California.
very beautiful. Yes.
And this is what they wrote about her. In terms of the acting, the entire cast did a great job, but Sierra O'Tilly Coleman,
Okay.
who played Charlie's sister,
All right.
truly shines. She delivers with
Thank
wit
you.
and youthful experience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing that. But those are the wonderful things of to remember and to keep and pass on to other people. Yes, sir.
In other words, you feel that something is lost, where 90% of the GIs World War II won't talk about my grandchildren and my wife never knew.
Well, you are guilty.
Excuse me?
You're guilty.
Why?
Because they would like to have some of those stories. I mean, some of them you have to clean up. I understand that. I don't know what you did, but some of them you might have to clean up. Okay, don't tell those stories.
90% of GI World War II won't talk.
Don't tell those war stories. Tell the good war stories. Okay?
Not even that good.
Well, the point is that I'm sure you did something good. I'm sure you did some. Well, you're laughing, so there must have been something that pleased you. Well, some of those stories they might be desirous of sharing with them, you know, taking from you and keeping. I have stories about my parents or my grandparents or even myself that I've shared with my children, and that's why